hand shot out of the dark and grabbed a man's ankle. He went down hard. His headlamp cracked against stone and died. Total blackness. He screamed, but the sound came back wrong. Bounced off walls he couldn't see. Twisted until it didn't sound like his voice. Something clicked. Not mechanical. Organic. Right next to his ear. He swung and hit cold air. Another click behind him. Then 3 more above. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded. The rescue team had come looking for bones. Old bones. 140 years of silence from a sealed underground facility meant everyone inside was dead. That was the assumption. The assumption was wrong. The thing crouching over Specialist Darren Coyle had a human skeleton. But nothing else about it was human anymore. What did 6 generations of total darkness do to the people sealed inside? Stay with me on this one. Now let me take you back. Not all the way back, but far enough. In 2031, the sky started dying. They called it the graying. A cascade of atmospheric failures, one triggering the next, turning breathable air into something that burned the lungs and blurred the vision. It didn't happen overnight. It took 11 months. Long enough for governments to panic, for bunkers to get funded, for lottery systems to decide who got to live underground and who stayed on the surface to take their chances. The Vale family got in because of Dr. Erin Vale. She was a structural biologist, useful to the program. She brought her husband Thomas, their 2 daughters, her brother's family, and a handful of others she'd fought to add to the list. 14 people entered a decommissioned mining facility in central Montana, retrofitted for long-term underground habitation. They had water recycling systems, seed vaults, protein cultivation tanks, solar batteries linked to surface panels, and a manual ventilation system powered by geothermal heat. Enough to sustain them for 30 years. Maybe 40 if they rationed carefully. The door sealed on September 14, 2031. A steel and concrete barrier, 4 feet thick, bolted from the outside by a military crew that told them help would come when the air cleared. Help never came. The surface panels failed within 6 years. Nobody arrived to repair them because there was nobody left to arrive. The Valles didn't know that. They just noticed the lights getting dimmer. Then dimmer still. Then the lights stopped working entirely. Erin kept a journal for the first 9 years. Her entries shrank as the power drained. The last one, written by feel on a page she couldn't see, read, "The children don't cry about the dark anymore. I think they prefer it." That was Generation 1. They remembered the sun. They talked about it constantly, described colors to children who had never seen them. Blue, green, the warmth of light on skin. They held onto those descriptions like prayers. Generation 2 still used those words. But they were just sounds now. Empty labels for experiences nobody alive had ever had. Like trying to describe music to someone born deaf. The second generation spoke normally, walked upright, ate cultivated protein from tanks they maintained entirely by touch. They repaired the ventilation system when it broke. They expanded the living quarters deeper into the mine shafts, chipping at rock with tools their parents had carried in. They buried their parents, the last people who had ever seen daylight, in a side tunnel they sealed with stones. They were resourceful, organized, and still recognizably human in every way. But their eyes had started changing. Pupils permanently dilated. Irises thinning. A few children were born with what the first generation's medical texts would have called a disorder. Extreme photosensitivity, pain at even the faintest glow from a hand crank lantern. Down here it wasn't a disorder. It was an advantage. Those children moved faster in the dark. They bumped into fewer walls. They found water sources by sound alone while everyone else was still fumbling. The body was already making its calculation. These organs are burning energy and returning nothing. Why maintain what you never use? By Generation 3, roughly 60 years in, children were born with eyes that barely functioned. Light sensitivity was extreme on the rare occasions they activated a hand crank lantern. Most of the time, they didn't bother. They navigated by sound and touch with a precision that would have stunned any neurologist on the surface. They could hear a water droplet striking stone from 40 meters away. They could identify a person by the rhythm of their footsteps echoing through the corridor. And something else had begun. The clicking. Nobody taught it. Nobody planned it. It just appeared. Third-generation children began producing sharp clicks with their tongues. Precise, controlled sounds that bounced off tunnel walls and returned carrying information. Distance, shape, density, openings, obstacles. It was echolocation. Not trained. Not practiced. Spontaneous. Babies did it before they could form words. It was faster than language for navigating dark space, for finding each other in deep corridors, for sensing a crack in the floor before stepping into it. Language didn't vanish overnight. It eroded. By the fourth generation, spoken vocabulary had shrunk to around 300 functional words. Everything else was conveyed through click patterns, vibrations pressed palm to palm, and low-frequency hums that traveled through the rock itself. Words were slow. Clicks were immediate. And in absolute darkness, immediate is what keeps you alive. Their bodies changed too. Skin lost all pigment. Not gradually. Completely. It went pale, then translucent. You could see veins underneath, the faint blue map of a circulatory system visible through skin as thin as paper. Frames grew leaner. Not from hunger, the protein tanks still functioned, maintained by ritual and muscle memory passed down through generations. They were thinner because mass costs energy, and underground, energy is the only currency that matters. Evolution doesn't carry what you don't need. It drops the weight and moves on. Generation 5 was the tipping point. Here's the thing about tipping points: you don't recognize them while they're happening. You only see them looking back. Children born in the 5th generation had eyes that were sealed shut. Not damaged. Fused. Smooth skin where eyelids should have been. Their ear canals had widened. Their fingers had grown longer, more sensitive, sheathed in nerve-dense tissue that could read surface texture the way sighted people read a printed page. They moved through the tunnels not as individuals navigating space, but as components of a single system. One clicked. Another answered. A third adjusted position. They flowed through corridors like water through a pipe. Seamless. Collective. Automatic. They stopped using names. Believe me, that detail matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you. When you stop using names, you stop thinking of yourself as separate. The 5th generation had no concept of individual identity the way we understand it. They were a network, a living sensory web distributed across 30 bodies. They shared food without negotiation. They slept in clusters, pressed together for warmth and shared vibration. They made decisions through a process that looked, from the outside, like total silence. But it wasn't silence. It was a conversation happening in frequencies below the threshold of human hearing. Agreement reached not through debate but through resonance. When they all hummed the same note, the decision was made. By the 6th generation, born roughly 130 years after the door was sealed, the transformation was complete. These were not people. Not by any definition the surface world would accept. They were pale, thin, eyeless beings with elongated limbs and fingers that could detect a heartbeat through 6 inches of solid stone. They communicated through clicks, hums, and tactile vibration. No written language. No spoken language. No concept of sky or sun or color or individual self. Their world was texture, echo, temperature, movement, and they had developed something no one could have predicted. They could feel you coming. Not hear you. Feel you. A footstep on stone sent vibrations through the floor, the walls, the air, in frequencies they had evolved to intercept. A 6th generation veil could sense someone entering the tunnel system from 200 meters away. They knew your weight, your pace, your direction, whether your heartbeat was calm or racing. And they knew, with absolute certainty, whether you belonged. Now let me tell you about the surface. Because the surface had changed too. The graying ended. Not because anyone fixed it. The atmosphere eventually corrected itself. Took about 80 years. Survivors who had endured on the surface rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, in scattered settlements that grew into cities again. Technology returned. Communication returned. And with communication came curiosity. People started looking for the old bunkers, the sealed facilities, the places where the previous world had tried to preserve itself underground. The Vale facility was flagged by satellite in 2168. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures below the surface. Not residual heat. Active biological heat. Something down there was alive. It took 3 years to organize the expedition. The military sent a 12-person team led by Captain Dana Serrano. She was experienced, methodical, hard to rattle. She'd opened 2 other facilities before this one. Both were tombs. Bones and dust and the dry smell of decay. She expected the same here. The team cut through the sealed door on March 3, 2171. The corroded metal fought them for hours. When it finally gave way, a rush of warm, humid air poured out. It smelled like wet stone and something organic. Something alive. Serrano sent Darren Coyle in first. He was the smallest, best fit for the narrow entry shaft. He went in with a headlamp, a radio, and a sidearm. He made it 40 feet before his lamp cracked against a low overhang and went dark. That's when the hand grabbed his ankle. Here's what happened after Coyle hit the ground. And this is the part nobody expected. The grab wasn't an attack. It took the team 3 full days to understand that. But in the moment, flat on his back in pitch blackness with something gripping his leg, Coyle didn't know that. His radio was still live. The team above heard everything. Clicks, dozens of them. Rapid, overlapping, coming from every direction at once. Then Coyle's breathing. Fast, ragged, panicked. Then something none of them had ever heard before. A hum, low and steady and resonant. It filled the tunnel like a vibration more than a sound. It wasn't threatening. It was something else entirely. Coyle stopped screaming. Not because he was hurt, because the hum was doing something to him. He described it later in his debrief as a feeling, not a sound. A pressure in his chest that slowed his heartbeat. His panic didn't vanish, but it dropped. Like a volume dial being turned down by someone else's hand. The beings had surrounded him. He could feel their presence. Breath on his neck. Fingers, long, cold, impossibly gentle. Touching his face, his hands, his tactical vest, his radio. They were reading him. Cataloging his shape, his temperature, his texture. They were gathering data the only way they knew how. Through touch. One of them pressed a palm flat against his chest. Held it there. Coyle said he could feel his own heartbeat reflected back through the creature's skin. Like it was listening to him from the inside out. Then they released him. Pulled back into the dark. The clicking faded until the only sound was Coyle's own breathing. He crawled out of that shaft shaking. He wasn't injured. Not a single mark on him. But something had shifted behind his eyes. Serrano saw it the moment he emerged into the portable floodlights. He sat on a crate and stared at nothing for 10 minutes before he could form a sentence. When he finally spoke, the first thing he said was not about the creatures. He said, "They were gentle." That word, gentle, coming from a man trained to assess threats. A man who had been grabbed and surrounded in total darkness by unknown organisms. That word changed the way Serrano approached everything that followed. The team medic checked Coyle over. Heart rate elevated but dropping. No injuries. No abrasions. No chemical exposure. His skin where the beings had touched him showed slight redness, like a mild friction burn, but it faded within an hour. Physically, he was fine, but he kept returning to the same detail. The palm on his chest. The reflected heartbeat. He said it felt like being understood. Not through words. Through something older than words. Something that bypassed every filter and went straight to the core of what he was. He couldn't explain it better than that. He didn't try. Serrano set up camp at the surface entrance. She filed her report. Biological entities. Non-hostile but unclassified. Requesting scientific support and revised engagement rules. Command told her to hold. She held for 2 days. And during those 2 days, the beings crept closer. Not into the light. Never into the light. But to the edge of it. At night, when the camp lights dimmed, shapes appeared at the tunnel mouth. Pale. Thin. Moving with a fluid coordination that looked rehearsed but wasn't. They were observing the surface team the same way they'd observed Coyle. Mapping them. Learning them. On the first night, one of the sentries reported hearing a sustained hum from the tunnel mouth. Low. almost musical. It lasted 30 minutes and then stopped. On the second night, 2 soldiers on watch saw a hand, long-fingered, pale, deliberately slow, extend from the darkness and touch the outer edge of the sealed door frame. It rested there for almost a minute. Then it withdrew, like someone touching a memory, like someone remembering what that door meant. Serrano watched the tunnel mouth through her thermal scope for hours. She counted at least 15 distinct heat signatures over 2 nights. They never repeated a position. They never stayed in the same configuration twice. They rotated. They communicated in real time about what they were observing. And they never, not once, crossed the line where the dark ended and the light began. That line was as clear to them as a wall. They respected it absolutely, which meant they understood boundaries, which meant they had rules. This is where it turns. Because up to this point, Serrano had been running a careful, measured operation. She was doing it right, taking her time, learning the situation before acting. And then Command decided that wasn't fast enough. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button. It means more than you think. Now let me tell you what happened when the people in charge lost their patience. On day 5, orders came from Command. Enter the facility. Full team. Document everything. The thermal scans showed at least 40 biological signatures. 40 living beings that weren't supposed to exist. Command wanted answers. Serrano pushed back. She'd spent 5 days watching these beings operate. Coordinated. Intelligent. Communicating in ways her equipment couldn't fully capture. This wasn't a recovery mission. This was first contact. And first contact has rules. Chief among them, you don't rush. Orders are orders. She briefed the team. 12 soldiers. Full tactical gear. Lights on every helmet. They descended at 0600. The tunnels were warm, humid, close. The walls were coated in something soft and faintly luminescent. The fungal gardens, though the team didn't know that yet. Their headlamps carved white corridors through absolute blackness. And the clicking began almost immediately. Not close, distant, like an alarm network lighting up. Click, 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 click. The patterns changed as the team moved deeper, faster, more layered, more complex. Every step was being broadcast through the entire tunnel system in real time. Serrano split them into 3 groups of 4. Standard sweep. Group 1 went left. Group 2 went right. Group 3, hers, went straight down the main corridor toward the thermal concentration. Group 2 found the gardens first. Walls blanketed in pale fungus that pulsed with faint bioluminescence, feeding on geothermal warmth. This was the food source. It was also, they learned later, part of the communication infrastructure. Vibrations stimulated specific growth patterns. The gardens weren't just nourishment. They were architecture. Living, growing, responsive architecture. Group 1 found the nesting chamber. A wide cavern with floors worn smooth by generations of bodies. Shallow depressions in the stone where the beings slept. And on the walls, Corporal Reeves found something that stopped him cold. Marks. Not writing. Not pictures. Raised ridges pressed into the fungal surface. Tactile patterns. Complex. Organized. Repeating. It was a recorded information system. A library you read with your fingertips. History, stored not in ink but in texture. Serrano's group reached the main chamber. And everything changed. The chamber was enormous. Their lights hit the far wall and failed to reach it. The ceiling vanished into blackness above. The floor was smooth, polished by a century of feet that never wore shoes. The air was different here, warmer, heavier, carrying a faint vibration that Serrano felt in her molars before she could identify it as sound. And standing in the center, arranged in a still half-circle, were 20 of them. Motionless, silent, eyeless faces turned toward the light sources, not because they could see, but because they could feel the heat radiating from the lamps. Their skin was almost luminous in the beam, translucent. You could trace the vein patterns in their necks, the ridges of bone in their forearms. Their fingers hung long at their sides, swaying slightly, the tips almost brushing the ground. They were thin in a way that didn't suggest starvation but efficiency. Every part of them that didn't serve a purpose had been pared away. What remained was functional, precise, alien. Serrano raised her hand. Her team stopped. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The clicking that had followed them through every tunnel, that constant, layered, tracking rhythm, had gone completely silent. The only sound was the hum of the headlamps and the breathing of 12 soldiers who had just come face to face with what humanity becomes when you take away the sun. Two species, standing 10 meters apart, separated by 140 years of living in different worlds. One built for light, one built for its absence. One of them stepped forward, taller than the others, thinner, fingers longer than any human hand should allow. It moved slowly, deliberately, the way you move when you want to make clear you are not a threat. It stopped 10 feet from Serrano, raised one hand, palm out. Serrano did the same. She didn't know if the gesture translated. She did it anyway. The being closed the gap, pressed its palm against hers. The skin was cool, dry, thin enough to feel the bone structure underneath. She could sense its pulse. And beneath the pulse, a faint vibration. A hum traveling through its entire body, through its hand, into hers. Then it vocalized. Not a click. A sustained, resonant hum that filled the chamber wall to wall. The others joined. 20 voices creating a harmonic wave that Serrano felt in her teeth, her sternum, the base of her skull. It wasn't language. It wasn't music. It was something between the two, something that carried meaning without a single word. Coyle, listening on the radio from above, said it sounded like grief. Serrano stood in that chamber with the hum washing through her body for what felt like hours. Then it faded. The tall one withdrew its hand, stepped back, and all 20 of them turned and moved into the deeper dark. Not running, not fleeing, walking, together. A single decision made by a single network housed in 20 separate bodies. They were leaving, choosing to go. The scientific team arrived a week later. Dr. Lena Okoro led the research. She was a comparative biologist who had spent her career studying convergent evolution, the way unrelated species develop similar solutions to similar problems. Bats and dolphins both evolved echolocation independently. Moles and cave fish both lost their eyes. She understood the logic of adaptation, but nothing in her training prepared her for what the Vale facility contained. She spent 4 months in and around the tunnels. Her team documented the fungal gardens, the tactile library, the communication system, the physical changes. They placed microphones in the corridors and recorded thousands of hours of click patterns. They used thermal cameras to track movement without light. They collected fungal samples, air samples, water samples, everything they could study without crossing the boundary the beings had established. Okoro mapped the click language and found it carried a vocabulary equivalent to roughly 1,200 distinct concepts, far richer than the 300-word spoken language it had replaced. It just didn't use words. It used space itself. A click bouncing off a specific wall shape at a precise distance meant something different than the same. Click in an open cavern. The angle mattered. The echo speed mattered. The tunnels were the dictionary. The architecture was grammar. Every chamber, every turn, every carved alcove was simultaneously a living space and a letter in an alphabet the beings had built without ever deciding to build it. She also documented something the military team had missed entirely. The beings practiced what looked like medicine. When a member of the network was injured, a fall, a cut from a sharp rock, the others converged. They pressed hands against the injury site. They hummed at specific frequencies that appeared to increase blood flow to the area. They didn't have tools or antiseptics, but they had vibration. And vibration in their world was everything. But Okoro's most important finding wasn't biological. It was about the door. When the military had cut through the entrance, they assumed the beings were trapped. Unaware of the surface, Okoro found evidence that blew that assumption apart. The inner side of the door had been reinforced, not from the original construction. Recently, within the last generation, the beings had found the door. They had felt the vibrations of the returning surface world. Vehicles, machinery, footsteps overhead. And they had chosen to make the barrier stronger. They knew the outside existed. They wanted nothing to do with it. This is where it gets difficult to sit with. But hear me out. When that door was finally cut open and light flooded into the facility for the first time in 140 years, the beings didn't panic. They didn't attack. They retreated. Deep into the farthest tunnels, away from the light, away from the sound, away from everything the surface represented. But before they retreated, the tall one stood at the boundary where darkness met light. It didn't step into the brightness. It stood at the exact edge and produced a single, long, complex click that echoed through every connected tunnel in the system. Koro recorded it, spent weeks analyzing the spatial acoustics. When she finally decoded it, the meaning was plain. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary marker. It meant, this is where your world stops and ours begins. Do not cross. Command didn't listen. Command wanted specimens. Tissue. Brain scans. They wanted to study the evolution, reverse engineer it, understand how this was possible. Serrano filed a formal objection. She argued that the beings had demonstrated territorial communication, non-hostile engagement, and collective decision-making. By any functional definition, they were a civilization. You do not dissect a civilization. Command overruled her. Sent a second team. Bigger. 20 soldiers this time, equipped with tranquilizer systems, containment units, and portable lighting rigs powerful enough to illuminate a football field. They entered the tunnels with the confidence of people who had never been afraid of the dark. They moved fast. Too fast. Their boots hit the stone floor like hammers, sending vibrations cascading through every connected passage. They made it 200 meters before the tunnels turned against them. The clicking started. Not the scattered tracking clicks the first team had heard. This was different. Coordinated. Rhythmic. Dozens of voices clicking in perfect unison, building a resonance that climbed and climbed until the stone walls began to vibrate at a frequency the soldiers could feel in their bones. Pebbles rattled free from the ceiling. Dust choked the air. The powerful lighting rigs flickered, dimmed, flickered again as the vibrations interfered with their electronics. A crack appeared in the ceiling of the main corridor. Not structural failure, but a demonstration. The facility was shaking itself apart around them. Not collapsing, threatening to collapse. A controlled, precise demonstration of exactly how much power the beings held over their own environment. The squad leader called the retreat at the 2-minute mark. By the 4-minute mark, half the team was running. They evacuated in 7 minutes total. 2 soldiers had minor injuries from falling debris. 1 had a nosebleed from the pressure differential the resonance created. Nobody was seriously hurt. The beings had calibrated it with surgical precision. Enough force to terrify, not enough to cause permanent harm. A warning shot fired not with a weapon, but with sound itself. Intelligent, restrained, and absolutely clear in its meaning. After that, command retreated. Not from respect, from the cold math of survival. If these beings could collapse their own tunnel system at will, any forced entry was a suicide mission. The military sealed the entrance again. Welded it this time. Posted a permanent guard. Serrano resigned 3 months later. She gave one interview to a journalist who had covered the first bunker openings. In it, she said she had spent her whole career preparing for the possibility of encountering non-human intelligence. She'd trained for it, run simulations, written protocols. She'd always imagined it would come from the sky, from space, from somewhere out there. She never expected to find it under a mountain in Montana. She never expected it to have started as us. She said the hardest part wasn't the creatures themselves. It was the look on the faces of the men who wanted to capture them. That look told her more about humanity than anything she'd seen underground. Okoro published her findings 2 years after the expedition. The paper was long, technical, and buried in an academic journal nobody outside her field would ever read. But near the end, she wrote one paragraph in plain language. She described returning to the main chamber alone, months into the study. Instruments off. Lights dimmed to nothing. She sat in total darkness for 3 hours. First, nothing. Just the drip of water somewhere far away and the sound of her own breathing. Then, slowly, the clicks returned. Faint at first, then closer, then all around her. The beings came back. Not to her, around her. They resumed their patterns. Moving, clicking, humming, tending to the fungal walls, pressing palms against each other in exchanges she could feel as faint vibrations in the stone beneath her. They moved around her the way a stream flows around a rock in the riverbed. Present, unbothered, accepting her as part of the landscape. She wrote that in that moment she understood the greatest adaptation the veiled descendants had achieved. It wasn't the eyelessness. It wasn't the echolocation or the translucent skin or the elongated fingers. It was the elimination of loneliness. Every member of the network was perpetually connected. Always felt, always known, always held within a web of awareness that never switched off and never let anyone drift to the edges. No isolation, no silence, no separation. In a world stripped of every comfort the surface takes for granted, light, warmth, space, sky, they had built something surface humanity, with all its technology and all its philosophy, had never managed to create. A community in which no individual was ever truly alone. The facility remains sealed today. The guard post is still manned. A small research station sits a quarter-mile from the entrance, staffed by a rotating team of 3 scientists who monitor the seismic sensors embedded in the rock above the tunnel system. Every few months, those sensors pick up vibrations from below. Clicks, hums, rhythmic patterns that suggest activity, movement, life. The beings are still down there, still functioning, still communicating in a language the surface may never fully decode. Life continuing without us, below us. In the dark we sealed them into and then forgot about. Darren Coyle never went underground again. He transferred to a desk assignment within a year of the expedition and never requested field duty after that. But in his original debrief, the classified one, not the sanitized version that made it into the public report, he said something that stayed with everyone who read it. When the being pressed its palm to his chest and he felt his own heartbeat reflected back, he also felt something layered underneath. A second heartbeat, not his, slower, steadier, more patient, the creature's pulse, falling into rhythm with his own. Not mimicking, merging, 2 separate systems finding a shared tempo in total darkness. For a few seconds, 60 feet below the surface of the earth, 2 entirely different species shared a single rhythm. 2 hearts that had no business beating together found the same frequency and held it. Not through effort, through something closer to instinct, or trust, or whatever comes before either of those things, in the dark, when there's nothing left but the sound of being alive. And then the dark took it back.